You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Today on From Embers, I am speaking with Dr. Alex Khasnabish, a writer, researcher, and teacher committed to collective liberation, living in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on unceded and unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. He's a professor in sociology and anthropology at Mount St. Vincent University, and his research focuses on radical imagination, radical politics, social justice, and social movements. Thank you so much for coming on From Embers today.
Thanks for having me.
I'd heard about you from hearing from my co-hosts that you had given a workshop at the Halifax Anarchist Bookfair. I figured maybe you could start by describing that workshop. Like, what were some of the main things you were hoping to get across, and how do you think it went? And did you find that there were interesting questions or conversations that came out of that space?
Yeah, for sure. So the workshop was entitled, You Can't Police Your Way Out of a Pandemic. And I had a snappy subtitle, which escapes me right now, something about paths towards collective liberation, learning from anti-authoritarian struggles in moments of crisis. And really, I just wanted to have a conversation with other anti-authoritarians and anti-capitalists in Halifax who had been obviously, like all of the rest of us, living under this pandemic for the last year and a half. And struggling with the ways that government and sort of the state most broadly had been dealing with it. And everywhere, obviously, this has taken on particular permutations. But in Nova Scotia, we had, a particular character to our, like the pandemic mitigation measures, which included the government going to the courts in, was it the fall? Maybe it was the fall, maybe it was last summer, to get an injunction, which basically, which was paired with its state of emergency, which allowed them to basically abrogate the right to protest. So you couldn't gather for any reason publicly to protest. And this ostensibly had been aimed at the anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers who were making a big fuss and were, sort of like openly denying COVID as a reality and flouting good sense public health measures. But quite tellingly, as soon as the injunction was granted, the first people who was used against were a pro-Palestinian solidarity demonstration, which the organizers had actually cleared with the cops well beforehand, and was a car protest. So everybody was in their bubble in their cars, and they still got cracked down on, and they still got ticketed. And, this was obviously this is an old story to lots of those of us who are participants in and students of social movements that, when you grant the state kind of carte blanche repressive power, even when it says it's going to use it against the right, it often the first targets are left-wing movements, social justice movements. And so, that was just one example. But early on in the pandemic, like many places in Canada and elsewhere, we'd had like public places shut down. People were encouraged to report on their neighbors if they thought they were seeing people gathering in greater numbers than they ought to be, all those kinds of things. So, I was invited to offer a workshop on this because I'd done some writing and thinking about kind of the uses and abuses of moments of crisis, both for the political establishment and for the far right. And I thought I had a couple of things to say about that, and the organizers very graciously thought I did too. I think I would have preferred more time for questions. I should have yapped less, and that's often my problem, and opened it up a bit more. But it was a good and fruitful discussion, I think. And, the other thing I wanted to do was not to play into this kind of libertarian interpretation of the crisis, which, kind of disavows the pandemic and disavows the necessity of taking important public health measures too, and going that kind of, rugged individualist way of trying to deny COVID away. So, balancing all of that.
With like a lot of these repressive state measures or police measures like curfews and gathering limits and borders and just all these restrictions on public and social life that were imposed, especially without corresponding economic shutdowns in factories and warehouses and farms, etc. From that, I sort of take that the goal of the state is to manage people effectively, to hold on to its own power and hold on to the existing social order. But also at the same time, I think for a lot of people, this pandemic has exposed the fault lines in that status quo and sort of caused like people to lose some of their confidence in the state or to question its role in managing our lives a lot more than they had before the pandemic. And you mentioned like state actors, but also far right forces taking advantage of that crisis to advance their own goals. Could you talk a bit about how various far right groups have been doing that, or what that has looked like in our context, I guess?
I think quite troublingly and frighteningly, because of the relative lack of strength of grassroots radical left movements on the ground in Turtle Island, so-called North America. The far right, I think, has stepped really nimbly into this moment. And I'm not trying to platform them or upsell them, but I think there's really been quite a incredible and rapid convergence between a variety of factors, not least, the kind of the toxic dumpster fire that is social media, that is corporate for-profit social media that accelerates to a previously, I think, unthinkable degree, the ability of conspiracy theories to propagate themselves, and combined with a sense of dread and an incredible and enforced alienation from one another and from sort of what we took to be normal life under capitalism. People, I think, were driven very aggressively into the arms of far right propagandists who are very able at crafting their stories online and circulating them. And I think that was met in different cases, of course, and we saw much of this south of the border, but we've seen this in Canada too, the emergence of this really kind of muscular, militarized far-right response to it too, which has met, to some extent, state repression with violence, but more importantly has threatened, I think, ordinary folks along a variety of levels with violence if they don't sort of agree with the denialists and the far right interpretation of what this current moment is showing us. And so, I mean, this is one of my central concerns. Like, my research historically has been on movements that I'm a participant in and that I like. But for the last couple of years, I've been studying the new fascism and the far right. And it just it is striking and cannot be overstated how prolific this moment has been for far right organizers, activists, and propagandists. As somebody who follows a whole bunch of Nazi channels on Telegram, I can tell you, there's a gleeful delight that this moment is being met with on their parts largely, and I think without a better story and without reaching out beyond our familiar scenes to people who we haven't been able to organize with us successfully, I think the far right is really entering into this and effectively contesting both state power and the limited responses of anti-authoritarians to combat this. And I think my concern is that those scales tip very quickly, and we have we're living in a moment of proliferating crisis. Right? It's not just the pandemic. Obviously, it is also the eco-social crisis of catastrophic climate change. It's it's an economic crisis too. It's the enduring crisis of heteropatriarchal, white supremacist, settler colonial capitalism that is in full bloom right now. And like the conversations that I think many of our movements have been having for years about how better to organize and how better to reach out in these moments, we sort of don't have time for them anymore. We have to be doing it already. And I think that's my fear. Certainly in places all across the global north, we're seeing a real resurgence of whether you want to call it fascism, neo-fascism, post-fascism, far-right insurgency in general, a really coordinated, multi-pronged strategy that's really creating cracks and openings for them in ways that really imperil our ability to hope to live in a democratic, peaceful, and just society.
So what about our failures? And maybe I also would ask you to try to differentiate a little bit among different parts of the radical left or anti-authoritarian social movements, because I think, both on the left and the right sort of sweeping generalizations sometimes kind of obscure some important differences. But in general, I would say that liberatory social movements generally have, in my view, sort of failed to effectively intervene in those far right, like recruiting and just power building activities, and that's worrisome to me. Why do you think we haven't been able to intervene as effectively as I would have liked, or what are some of the ways that we could sort of disrupt those narratives that the far right is building around the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's this is the one at least of the very key questions that I think is huge and open ended, and I certainly don't pretend to have any perfect answer to. I'm just trying to reflect on some of the wisdom that's been shared with me from activists and organizers engaged in anti-capitalist, decolonial, radical social justice struggles, particularly in this place called Nova Scotia today, where I've lived and worked for the last 15 years. So, like, one of the big things for me is that, and we heard this time and again in this project that I ran with a friend and colleague of mine for years, the Radical Imagination Project here in Halifax, when we were kind of trying to get activists together to have these difficult, open-ended conversations with each other about what winning meant, what the future looked like, what they understood their own political histories and imaginations to be, and how they thought about them in dialogue with other people's struggles. One of the things that kept coming back was this deep and overriding sense of pessimism that many people feel. And I think, the pandemic reflects this. I don't think I'm saying anything profound when I say that this is this is the kind of central insight of, Gramsci's theory of hegemony and how the prevailing order works, right? It doesn't work just materially to structure our lives. Obviously, it works to colonize and constrain our imaginations of what is possible, what is thinkable, what is beyond this. And, it's just like, there's an incredible weight to that I think we don't need to feel it's a failure. I mean, I always feel bad when I frame it that way. I don't mean to frame it that way. Sometimes failures are really failures and losses are really losses, and successes are really successes. But sometimes, it's ambivalent, and we're it's just Like, what we really should be talking about is how we can better sustain and then build power in our struggles and connect them to other struggles. And that's sort of a more interesting question that, we think about the work of revolution or a radical social change as one that happens over the very long haul and not episodically. And I think obviously activists and organizers understand that. Again, I'm not saying anything profound, but I do think that there is something, I don't want to periodize this too hard, but let's say over the last, certainly since the kind of ebbing of what was the global social justice movement in the early 2000s, and that kind of foreclosure that was marked by September the 11th, that we really have been living through what I think would be fairly characterized as a really dark time. And as somebody who came of age politically, right around the Zapatista uprising and the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that, I remember other dark times, and I'm sure older activists and researchers and just people alive can remember other very dark times. But I do think there's something that is kind of deep-seated and existential in people's sense of doom, and the pandemic certainly exacerbated that. It threw fuel on the fire of our already simmering or outright raging, relations of oppression that characterize a society like the one we live in. Made people afraid of other people. The discourse, I think, of and to some extent you have to. I'm not really blaming doctors or public health specifically here, but this is what I think is interesting is what the pandemic as a biological phenomenon revealed about our social relations. So it doubled down on seeing other people as threats, which we've already been deeply conditioned to do, right? So that has the effect, I think, in activist spaces sometimes of kind of encouraging us to circle our wagons even more. We already, I think, inhabit a very scene-based movement structure where, and this was described to me years ago by an activist who had done a lot of solidarity work with the Zapatistas as the difference between not to romanticize the global South in any kind of way, but we could think about lots of movements in this regard. The difference between what many of us do in places, what many of us anti-authoritarians do, let's say, in places like so-called Canada, where we're kind of defectors or dissenters from the status quo. We find each other in our smaller places. We build something meaningful there, but that meaningful space doesn't necessarily reach beyond our kind of common and received notions of who belongs, our culture building within those activist spaces. And, it can be pretty alienating, I think, and or kind of intimidating for outsiders, for people without any real history or background in that kind of activism to sometimes enter into those scenes. I mean, even anarchist book fairs, which are so wonderful, and I love to go to them, can sometimes be really intimidating for people, I think, who don't have any understanding of the politics behind it. And I think the far right, to be honest, for a variety of reasons, both because they trade in notions and understandings of the world that we would reject as anti-authoritarians, right? They embrace a vicious, hierarchical, every person for themselves model in many ways, this kind of eternal war of all against all that resonates with people's kind of received understandings of the world, right? The stories they tell make more sense within this space shaped by ruling class relations already. So, it's just they're playing in that field. Now they have different aspirations than the existing ruling class, but because their myth making, their storytelling, their cultural codes, all their signposts all kind of work within that larger frame, they have a less steep hill to climb. And that was pretty interesting. I do think that's interesting to see the extent to which, you had so-called middle class Canadians, for example, who hadn't previously seemingly been involved in activism, kind of roped into anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown activism, outside of whatever their favorite like rib joint in outside of Toronto, or mad about the fact that they can't go to the gym without wearing a mask, and they go so far as to start talking with other people on Facebook pages and on Telegram or on Gab or whatever. They're roped into that. They're fed, like out of that sense of, aggrieved entitlement, what Michael Kimmel has called aggrieved entitlement. This idea that I was never meant to suffer like this, and so my suffering is that spark that lights the fuse, and far right activists and organizers, especially on the what I would call the proto-fascist right, are eager to cultivate that and to trade in that, and to sort of like nurture that sense of a people against the world. And that tends not to be the story the left tells, either in its more sort of social democratic formations or in its more radical anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian ones. I mean, I like to think we tell better stories, to be honest, but much more welcoming ones, much less violent, much less genocidal ones, certainly. But what's striking, I think, is in this moment where you do have all these multiple intersecting crises, I think people feel like they are, that they are, it's going to be them or someone else. And everything about your society tells you that that's the way things work. That's a very, I think, like, it's a very superficial answer in some ways I think I'm giving, but also like there is, I think, something to that makes those stories resonate and makes it much more difficult for us to tell better, more collectively liberating stories that lead people to decide that there are other ways of living in the world that don't require you to oppress somebody else, another group of people, and exploit them in order to make yourself safe and secure.
In terms of state measures to control the spread of COVID-19, like vaccine passports, border hardening, etc., can you maybe describe a bit what that has looked like in your specific region of either Halifax or the Maritimes? I know there's been an Atlantic bubble. I'm curious about what that has been like.
There's a kind of a neo-feudal structure a little bit to social life and especially economic power and relations out in the Maritimes, and that tends to play into a certain kind of deference to leadership and to elites that I don't really feel. I mean, maybe again, it's been a long time since I actually lived in central Canada, but that I don't feel present in the same way elsewhere. And I'm not saying people here are simply followers or sheep or anything like that, but I do think there's something to that character that changes things a bit. So very early on, we locked down here, I think much earlier than folks did elsewhere in so-called Canada. And I do actually think this is where I would quibble, well, more than quibble, with some of my more libertarian-minded comrades, that I think, like from a public health standpoint, lockdowns make a lot of sense when you need to, provide a circuit breaker moment when a virus is spreading really rapidly and people are getting sick and dying. And but like if you read the public health literature on this stuff, it's clear that lockdowns are basically a mechanism of last resort. They're not meant to control the virus. They're meant to like intervene in a moment of exponential growth. And obviously, in a just society, we would have proper supports. Like that's not leaving the Amazon warehouse open. That's not leaving the superstore open so you can get your groceries. That's like everybody's locked down. We're going 2 weeks, but everybody is supported. And of course, that's unthinkable for so many people in a society like ours. They're like, they closed public parks, beaches, basically the outdoors too, which was, people immediately pushed back on and were really and rightly outraged by. And this was, these were in the months, I think, before there was a better understanding that COVID was airborne. But even now, most public health officials will talk about how safe it is to be outside with people, especially if you're socially distanced and masked. And so that was like, happily, that was eliminated. Those restrictions were lifted fairly quickly. But again, the other aspects of it, I mean, so I guess the story I want to tell is a story of, in many cases, important and good sense public health measures that I think were implemented and were willingly and consensually followed by people in the Atlantic bubble, but that were misapplied also and used or weaponized, I guess, into a tool of state repression in the way that they were carried out, because they just empowered the cops, for example, or empowered the courts, or took away a charter right, that is, the right to assemble and to express yourself, for example, collectively, all under the guise of public health intervention. So we had a lot going on out here, right? I mean, what drives me up the wall a little bit is this idea that that all those measures are bad ideas, and like I think I fly a little bit in the face of some of my anti-authoritarian comrades and fellow travelers when I think. I mean, I have to admit that I think that vaccine passports, whatever we want to call them right now, are going to be necessary measures in a society like ours to control the spread of COVID. And I think that largely not because I welcome the idea of regulating people based on their vaccination status, but you don't just throw open the doors and say, we live in a free society now, and we expect you all to be your best selves. Unfortunately, the reality is that the vaccines, like their development process, is problematic. I'm not begrudging people their concerns around their development, but they've proven efficacious and life-saving. And they are, I think, from my perspective, there are a lot of people in my community some of whom I live with, who are immunocompromised or can't get the vaccine yet. And it's a bit reckless and a bit selfish, I think, for people, especially without a good reason for doing so, to be skeptical of the vaccines when they have been demonstrated to be effective, and to suggest that we don't need any measures like that at all. I mean, this is the challenge, I guess, I left at the book fair too. Like, if you don't want them, then how are we going to convince people to do the things that are necessary to keep each other safe? And, we can talk about, like, my long-term vision is always like, oh, well, like, Federation of Autonomous Communities would look a lot different and handle this very dramatically differently than the state. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. So how, in the medium term, do we actually negotiate some of that? But the things that I do push back on, and I have, vocally pushed back on, and lots of folks were worried about here, were, for example, providing the cops with yet another tool to write tickets and to apply huge fines to people who are found in violation of public health orders. So, you had basically a doubling down of the war against the poor, and, especially houseless people, all kinds of folks who found themselves in the crosshairs, who couldn't be anywhere but in public spaces because they didn't have a home to be in. They didn't have a house to go to, right? The shelters were full. We have like a true crisis of housing here in Nova Scotia broadly, but especially in Halifax. So it again provided, why did the police have to be the tool for that? That seemed not at all a good one, and encouraged, again, people to inform on neighbors. That's not a culture that I want to participate in or support. That was a huge issue. Again, the ban on protest, which thankfully was lifted. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association was going to take the government to court over that one, and so the provincial government pulled that restriction days before they were set to go to court over it. But again, a completely opportunistic attempt on the part of the ruling class, I think, to slip something in that was not, so the police, even in that moment, already had those extended powers to deal with protesters who weren't obeying public health measures. Why did you need a blanket ban on protests that was also tied to the state of emergency? We're still under a state of emergency here in Nova Scotia. We have been since March 2020. So like that's effectively an unlimited ban on freedom of assembly, of speech, of political opinion, all that kind of stuff. And it's more than a broadside against social justice movements. It's a head-on attack. And predictably, again, like I said before, the first people targeted it was the anti-maxers and maskers and the anti-vaxxers who were, given as the reason, whenever politicians had to describe why they were doing what they were doing, they brought that out. So everybody could kind of bash on them. And, they had very little public uptake around that. But predictably, it was the pro-Palestinian solidarity gathering that was actually the first and much more muscular example of the application of police power in that moment. So I think it's those kinds of things that I'm very concerned with. I mean, mandatory masking, social distancing, and to the extent that the vaccines are problematic, I would certainly say, it would be foolish to say that we know what the long-term issues with them may be. We don't yet. But my main concern is that, too much medical innovation is housed in for-profit corporations, not the application or not the development of important public health measures like vaccines, which are a critical tool in the public health arsenal, I think, against things like COVID. So, I think for me, it's sometimes that gets painted in some of the discussions I've been involved in. I've been a little bit troubled by the kind of laissez-faire attitude of many younger activists towards things like the vaccine mandates and seeing them as an attack on kind of collective freedom. I don't agree, and I respect the fact that other people are coming at this, and obviously people from racialized and impoverished communities. There's a long history of medical abuse. I mean, that's I'm an anthropologist by training. I've been trained in a discipline that has very bloody hands in some ways, in terms of its uses and abuses towards racialized, colonized, and poor people. Tons of implication in relations of ruling. But it doesn't mean that everything we learn from social research or anything we learn from, medical developments, therefore, is tainted. It means that we have to approach it critically and carefully. And I think that there is room for understanding that this moment requires certain kinds of, like good faith compromises, maybe that we wouldn't make otherwise. But that there are other things that we can't let go of at the same time and can't give into, because once they're gone, they're gone. And that ban on protest was frightening, frankly.
And clan robes, sexist, racist, homophobes, Aryan nations and hammer skins. You can wear my nuts on your Nazi chins. I love a man in uniform. And just what exactly are the great historical accomplishments of your race that make you proud to be white? Capitalism, slavery, genocide, sitcoms. This is your fucking white history, my friend. So why don't we start making the history worth being proud of and start fighting the real fucking enemy? Swastikas and clan robes, sexist, racist, homophobes. This one's for the master race. My brown power ass in your white power face. Kill them all and let a Norse god sort them out.
I kind of hear what you're saying in terms of like looking at these different measures and saying, okay, according to one's own priorities or what you feel is important, supporting some and not others. I feel like myself and maybe many other anarchists I know have been trying to do that all along on the scale of sort of like our personal lives and contexts and even organizing contexts in terms of like understanding that the state is going to make certain or enforce certain rules, make certain demands of people for its own priorities, and people who care about COVID and also freedom, I guess I would say is a shorthand, are going to sort of navigate their own way through that situation. Because, I mean, I agree that I want people to be vaccinated. I think it is probably overall good. In a different world without a state or economic situations that sort of force us into situations way beyond our control, these questions I think would be a lot different, and people would have more autonomy in terms of like making those choices with each other instead of sort of trying to enforce their will on each other one way or the other. I guess I sort of am wondering, like, do you have an answer to, or for people who are saying, well, for whatever reason, I don't want to get a vaccine, or I feel I have legitimate concerns about the vaccines or something. And like, how do you navigate that ethically, I guess, in a world where we are all sort of stuck together, but people are trying to sort of maintain their individual autonomy and look out for each other? Yeah, I know it's a big question.
No, it's a great question. I think this is kind of conversation that we should be having, obviously, and yeah, and I don't have a simple answer for that. I guess the way that I come at it is, I always kind of center non-coercion as the principle of my social life, right? So I'm a professor at a university. It's like a central institution in the ruling class apparatus in our society. I'm not at all sort of mystified by that, but in my classroom, obviously, in the way that I engage with students, like I think I bring a sincere and committed anti-authoritarian, non-coercive approach to that dynamic, and that's just important. That's super important to do, right? I think in all our relations, we should be governed by that, and what that looks like in every specific case and place looks obviously a little bit different. Depending upon what we're doing together and what our ends are. But yeah, I completely buy the argument that you don't end up in a liberated society by coercing people into it. I think for this, I mean, the issue of vaccines has become so contentious and weaponized and culture worry, and I think it's that's a real problem. I think it's sort of the wrong part of the issue to focus on, but it's become a big flashpoint. So I suppose when I talk to people who are vaccine hesitant, I always want to know their reasons. And some people have very good reasons. And many people have, frankly, very conspiracy-oriented reasons. And I hear this just as much amongst some of my anarchist comrades as I do amongst the right, to be honest. I hear like an incredible, and that's not without reason. Like much like anthropology and social science and all this stuff, medical science has been up to its eyeballs in the abuse of vulnerable people and populations. And we need to think about health holistically. We don't need to think about a pill for everything, a medical intervention for everything, when in reality, if people lived less grinding, less dominated, less exploited lives, they would be healthier anyway. They would have more time if they lived in decent housing, if they earned even a decent wage. Even if we're talking capitalist terms, still, like all these things, obviously, as you said before, right? Like the changed context means that we would be addressing these things in very different ways, but we don't live in that world. And we're not anywhere close to that world. So I don't know how, I have a 9-year-old son who can't be vaccinated. When I hear younger comrades talk to me about how they don't believe in the vaccine and they don't, they think these measures are oppressive and coercive and, et cetera, all of which I agree with. They do have that effect. My question is, how do you know you're not spreading it to vulnerable populations like my kid who can't yet make the choice one way or another about whether he wants to be vaccinated, or my 80-year-old mom? I don't think autonomy is relational, right? This is the lesson taught by the best social movements. When, I've had the great privilege of visiting Zapatista territory, I love their approach to social revolution because it didn't predicate or wasn't predicated on idealized notions of freedom and autonomy. It was very grounded and real. And, so they deal with theft or rape or drug abuse in their communities in very particular ways, in some ways that bother anarchists, I think. And I appreciate that. I understand why. I'm not trying to romanticize that example. But for me, I think this is we are in the midst of a crisis right now. And if you're not going to, I get it. You don't want to, we can talk about those reasons. And I'm not saying that Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, or any of the other purveyors of this particular technology have our best interests at heart necessarily. But I think there are lots of lessons to be taken from good-spirited grassroots community demands for better treatment, like that come to us from ACT UP, and as one example, that didn't deny the utility of those medical advances, just demanded better grassroots control of them, demanded a non-profit oriented motive behind them, but absolutely embraced the necessity of people having access to them. And I'm always reminded, like, again, when I was in Zapatista territory and we were talking about, reproductive freedom for Indigenous women, we were told time and again that that involved not only access to abortion in a country that is extremely Catholic and where that's extremely, where it's been illegal for the longest time, but it also meant access to high quality facilities and trained personnel who could help you successfully birth babies. It's not what we tend to talk about in the North as much, right? Because the war is on the other side. And that's totally real and totally applicable. But I think it's, this is one of those questions where, context is everything. And if you grew up in a context where epidemic disease that spreads very insidiously is characterizing your life and shortening and directly impacting people's lives in that way, you just have a very different perspective on this. And I frankly I'm a bit fed up with the war over the vaccines and the idea that people should be trusted to manage their own ability to engage with others when you might not know that you're spreading it. And that has real implications for some of the most vulnerable people in our lives. I take a real cue from some of the great anti-authoritarian activists and thinkers I've had the great privilege of being introduced to and working with over the years, who are vaccinated right now and who absolutely center the immunocompromised communities in their lives who cannot be, and who we have to be a firewall for. We have to be. And if you're not willing to do that, this is like why there's still a little bit of coercion in my classes at the university, because I've run experiments in throwing the doors of freedom wide open, and students have been socialized in this society. So when you remove all of that structure that's sometimes interpreted as coercion but doesn't necessarily have to be, what's the incentive for people to be their best selves? And we'd like to think that people will rise to that occasion and embrace that. But the absence of restriction doesn't always lead to that. Sometimes it just leads to really shitty behavior. And lots of activist scenes are filled with like really vile cultures of sexual abuse. And this is something we tracked again and again in the research we were doing in Halifax years back, that went completely unaddressed because the dudes in the movement didn't want to talk about it. And they ran the show and successfully defrayed all these discussions, again, under the realm of like, this is engaging in carceral behavior that the state propagates. We don't do that here. And I think, like the reality is that no society is without rules, right? So I don't know. The vaccine passport to me is not the thing to be struggling against. For me, yes, hardening of borders internationally, the identification of particular populations. So the ban on Indians, for example, people holding Indian citizenship, flying to Canada, that was problematic to me, much more troubling, much more problematic than saying you can't go to your gym because you haven't been vaccinated and you refuse to be. So those are different things to me. And and I think until we get a handle on that, until people stop dying in such great numbers, until we actually get a sense of what long COVID means for the people who are contracting it, I don't think we can be so cavalier. And I just think we do a lot of other things in our daily lives. I'm going to admit that I fall into the age group that was at risk from the AstraZeneca blood clot related side effect, and I didn't want to get that shot. I don't begrudge people making that decision, but as a generally healthy middle-aged person, I saw it as my obligation to go and get vaccinated to help control this. And and I just think that's a fruitful opportunity for us to be maybe a little bit less ideological and abstract in what we think autonomy means, and a little bit more grounded and centered in the material realities of what life means. And the fact is that humans are great hosts for a variety of other organisms that want to make use of us as ecologies to propagate themselves. And we always have been. So that's not something that comes in with the state. That's something that's simply a fact of you being the biological organism you are on this planet. So I see a little too much quibbling over what counts as a good reason not to be vaccinated. I guess I just leave it at that. I don't want to shame people into this, but I do think that this is something that continues to imperil people. And if you want, for example, lots of folks would say, like, we want paid sick days. We don't want, grocery store clerks, for example, just to be considered essential workers and put in harm's way. But then at the same time, you're saying, but I don't want to get the vaccine because I don't trust Pfizer. And I'm worried that, like, whatever your specific concern is, then I think that is the challenge for better education around, for all of us, myself. Like, I'm not saying I have the answers to this, but for sure it points to a failure, or not a failure. It points to what our education system has always been meant to do, which is to create, appropriately disciplined subjects for exploitation. So, the fact is, we don't live in a world where we can have these kinds of fruitful conversations. We don't live in a non-coercive world. And so people perceive that coercion as an immediate threat to them politically, and not just physically, not just existentially. And I think sometimes we're just dealing with different things. We need better information. We need better communication. We need non-coercive rules for our society that people learn to respect and abide by, because they understand that they are part of making society just and free and democratic, hopefully too. And that's going to be a long road to get there, because it involves unlearning so much about our current context.
I can appreciate that perspective. Maybe my last question is just, are there ways that anarchists or anti-authoritarians or radicals elsewhere in the world have been opposing pandemic-related state control measures that you find inspiring, or do you think there are lessons that we could learn from elsewhere that might make sense here?
I would love to say yes to this. I mean, whether it's my, like, the fact that I've been so focused on sort of like surveilling the far right for so long now, I feel like from my perspective, there is an absence of effective counterexamples. But I would say that it does say something about the way that this moment has been captured by the right, and this is, it's the old story about moments of crisis, and be careful what you wish for, and that, the catastrophe, when it presents itself, doesn't necessarily open itself to more collectively liberated outcomes. It can also be seized by much more nefarious and authoritarian and genocidal ones. And it makes me worry a great deal about the way that the climate emergency is also being seized on by far right actors, and what it will mean when people. I mean, we had, obviously on the west coast of so-called Canada this summer, hundreds of people dying as a result of that, of the heat dome, climate change, right? And rather than that producing like a good faith freak out, even amongst, kind of the liberal, the squishy liberal middle class, that demanded, answers from its government, and to prevent further deaths, it has been, I think, greeted with this incredible sense of circling the wagons, preserving the status quo, really doubling down on existing relations of oppression and exploitation, and making them much more muscular and robust. And I think we have a lot to think about there, but we have a lot to be worried about. I think that collusion between an imperiled state. I mean, it's like the classic fascist moment, right? And I hate to overstate history, because I think, history can guide us, but, we shouldn't imagine that we're caught in some endless loop. But this really like awful moment where we have a shaky and imperiled existing ruling class who are willing to enter into relationships with fascists and the authoritarian right in order to preserve power, and convince themselves in moments like this, like, oh, we're still in charge, we're driving the bus. I mean, that's like the classic example of Nazi Germany, obviously, but we don't need to just, endlessly invoke Hitler to prove how dangerous these moments are. And I would just like, I guess I would urge all of us, or invite all of us who care about collective liberation, who describe ourselves as radicals, revolutionaries, anarchists, um, who are committed to social justice and a vision of revolution that involves collective liberation, to think about like what we need to do immediately in order to defang some of these movements that are gaining traction on the ground. And I don't have easy answers for that. Like, I'm trying right now to talk to more people and to engage with more people outside of my political scene. These are community members, co-workers, neighbors who are being led down, this really brutal, frightening path, and trying to, just trying to intervene in ways that remind them of our common humanity, remind them that other people are not their natural enemies, that we can find ways out of this moment that lead to a better world and not a worse one. But it is shocking to me, to be honest, and I think of myself as a fairly cynical person a lot of the time. It's shocking to me the way that even amongst younger people today, the kind of common sense idea that the world to come is going to be nothing but worse than what we have now, that is a dystopian fantasy that animates some of the worst reactionary tendencies, or fascist ones, outright fascist ones. So I don't know, how do we seize the ground back? Like, we were fairly successful in pushing back against fascists on the ground in the Trump era, sort of in that whole period of time before COVID, and winning some pretty important fights. There was a lot of hope, I think, in those moments. And I feel the pandemic has worked against us. It's worked directly against what is a strength of the left broadly. And I'd even say the social democratic left here too, which is organizing, person-to-person organizing, grassroots communication, that kind of like going to work activity, being with other people, creating context, whether that's a boring old union meeting at your workplace or an anarchist book fair, or, providing critical intervention in the midst of a hurricane, like we saw, with the Occupy Sandy response, for example, Mexico City in 1985, when the government totally failed and just ordinary folks went to work. There's so many good examples, right, of this, but they're all they all exist in contexts that are not shaped by a pandemic, where a highly transmissible disease spreads through person-to-person contact and is probably airborne. And the state has used that opportunistically, but it's also like it's been the dagger through our heart in some ways. Maybe not a dagger, that's too dramatic, but it's like cut us off at the knees, I think, a little bit. And I don't know. I see a lot of familiar stuff right now. I think leftists broadly have been really good at using different social media platforms to communicate with each other, and to hold events in the pandemic world. But that's an awfully self-selecting crowd that opts into that stuff. Where are the examples of pandemic relief that are being provided in anti-authoritarian ways, like we might think of in terms of like an Occupy Sandy approach, right? Like, I think scaling those things up might be exciting, right? And this is something that I mentioned in that Roar article. Like, the idea of mutual aid is critical here, obviously, and will continue to be. It's often the bone that fascists hold out. They don't mean it, but they're like, oh, you'll be, if you belong, you'll be part of a community that actually takes care of you. Wouldn't that be nice? They're tapping into that exact sense of disillusionment with the status quo that the left, even the tepid milquetoast reformist left, has acknowledged and talked about for so long. But certainly radicals have long identified and point out. We have great analysis of, but it's in moments like this where we actually need to, I think, put some of that together and go to work. And whether that's creating groups in community where people who don't have access to, who don't have access to childcare, if they're working, that we're doing some of that, whether that's helping people get groceries or medication to them, if they can't be mobile and out, and providing that in a systemic, non-crisis response way, but in a way that builds long-term capacity and power. Frankly, finding ways to build eventually alternative ways of like governing ourselves and doing the stuff of, making the stuff that we need to survive day to day. Like finding those spaces. I think that the tragic thing is in our current moment, we've simply seen, like up till now, really a cementing and augmenting of the worst aspects of this awful, exploitative, repressive, capitalist nightmarescape that we inhabit. And rather than seeing ways out, we've been really like hemmed in on every side. And so like we have to break out from that enclosure. We have to prove that there's a better way of doing things by doing it in community. And again, I'm sure there are a bunch of great examples, and I apologize for the fact that my eyes have been drawn to the far right rather than those. So I'm kind of presenting a bit of a film negative response here. I just, looking at what the right is doing successfully right now, we shouldn't want to replicate them. We should simply acknowledge that in the midst of this, they have devised very effective strategies, and their forms of storytelling are resonating incredibly persuasively right now. Again, for reasons that we don't have to feel bad about, because they fit those dominant narratives already. But we have to be able to redirect that energy and to siphon it off, to create better alternatives. Because otherwise, it's just all these people being led down these paths to hospital protests, to like armed responses to the militia responses we've seen in the States, this kind of stuff, and that certainly isn't going to lead to a freer or more peaceful world.
Was there anything that I haven't asked you about that you were really burning to mention or that you wanted to say?
No, I mean, I think that was a really great conversation. I guess I would just, by way of clarification, because I know it's a thorny issue, and I just, would want to come back to it again, that, it's the same note that I left the book fair on that day, because I got some really great questions from people expressing concern over the things that, you raised in your questions, right? The regulation of people's lives and identities and ability to live decently through this policing of whether it's their vaccine status or their health status. And I mean, obviously, we don't need to look very far. Look at the way that HIV status was weaponized, was criminalized, with really like horrible implications for people who are HIV positive in this country and others. So we absolutely, that people are well within their rights. And again, racialized communities, indigenous communities, I don't begrudge for a second the hesitancy many of them have towards these public health mandates, and especially the idea of compulsory vaccination. So I just don't want to come across as being an autocrat or trying to be authoritarian about my politics around that. I prefer to think of it as a form of anti-authoritarian pragmatism, but maybe I just I'm willing to admit that maybe I'm trading short-term efficacy for what I believe is a longer-term gain, but maybe that's a terrible idea. I would like to see, I guess what I would say to people who are hesitant around that stuff is, then give me a model, or at least give me a relation that we could start building into our social lives on a daily basis that would offer us the same kinds of things, that would encourage us to be as decent, as careful, as solidaristic as we can be towards each other, that keeps us safe, that keeps this very pernicious disease from spreading as easily as it's been spreading. And then I will wholeheartedly follow you, but it can't just be this rhetoric of, I have concerns and this is coercion, and so I should be able to simply flout this and be in society and do what I need to do, because, that's not obviously good enough. And I'm not trying to, present it as a caricature, but I do think I have yet to hear those alternatives. It's simply hesitancy, which I get. But again, I think we need to do better right now. And so that's the only thing I would say, I guess. I'm willing to admit that my stance on the mandates is probably not a welcome one in a lot of anti-authoritarian spaces.
I appreciate you sharing your perspective on it. And I think, this is how we're going to find a way forward, I guess, is through having conversations and trying to convince each other of stuff and trying to come up with those alternatives, because I'm also looking for those answers, I guess. That's how I feel about it. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and for having this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks again for the invitation. It was great.
Join us for Kite Line, a weekly radio program on Channel Zero Network that focuses on issues in the prison system. With over 50 episodes already released, you can hear informative and riveting stories about the impact of prisons on people both inside and outside of the prison walls, and how they fight back.
Kite Line is intended as means of communication between people across prison walls. Our goal at Kite Line is to amplify the voices of those within the prison system while encouraging dialogue with those on the outside.
Hear us on the Channel Zero Network and visit our website for more information or previous episodes at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.